Up next, Heroes and Patriots with host John Goodiron and Mary Massey. The views and opinions expressed on Heroes and Patriots are not necessarily those of the board and volunteers of the Mendocino Environmental Center or KMEC Radio. Heroes and Patriots is a program about national security, intelligence, and foreign policy. Underwriting for Heroes and Patriots is provided by Dr. Richard Phillips of the Ukiah Dental Center. Visit his website at ukiahdental.com. Dunlap Roofing with offices in Ukiah, Fort Bragg, and Willits. Visit their website at dunlaproofing.com. Fry Vineyards and Winery, located in Redwood Valley, America's first organic winery. Visit their website at frywine.com. And underwriting is also provided by Ore Hot Springs, a retreat and spa located between Ukiah and Mendocino. Reservations are required. Call 707-462-6277 or make your reservations on their web at orehotsprings.org. Thanks to our associate producer, Elliot Hershkovitz-Hale, and tech support from Govinda Dalton and Joel Thompson for today and all of our shows. Today is Monday, February 12th, 2018. We welcome back John from New York City, and we are coming to you live from the studios of the Mendocino Environmental Center, located in historic downtown Ukiah. Good morning, John.
Thanks, Mary. It's good to be back. It's been a busy couple of weeks. We've got a great guest today, Jimmy Galbraith, one of the leading economists in the world today, and perhaps the leading progressive economist in the world today. Thank you, Jimmy, for agreeing to be on the show. I think this is your third appearance with us and your first appearance here at the Mendocino Environmental Center.
Jamie, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much. Nice to be with you.
I would like to give our listeners a little bit of background information, if I might, and then we'll start right into today's program. Mr. Galbraith is currently a professor at the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs and Department of Government, University of Texas at Austin. Mr. Galbraith heads up the University of Texas Inequality Project, which has been described by economic historian Lord Skidelsky as pioneering inequality measurement. Mr. Galbraith is chairman of the Economists for Peace and Security, formerly known as Economists Against the Arms Race, and later Economists Allied for Arms Reduction, an international association of professional economists. I want to mention two of his most recent books that were both released in 2016. The first, Inequality, What Everyone Needs to Know, and the second, Welcome to the Poisoned Chalice. John, do you want to begin with our first question?
Sure. Jamie, good to have you back. Ron Paul has been a recent guest on our show, and I'm certainly a big fan of his as well. With all the sell-offs we're seeing in the market, despite today's dead cat bounce, as it were, Ron Paul has called for a doubling down on his call for a 50% chance of a market crash. To our listeners out there who have retirement accounts, IRAs, and Roths and 401ks, and whose every market gyration gives them pause and keeps them up at night, what do you think of Ron Paul's prognosis?
Well, it's interesting that I'm intersecting with Congressman Paul again after all these years. Sometime in the middle 1970s, we debated each other over the gold standard on a radio station in Washington, D.C. I don't think he had the better part of that argument, and I'm afraid to say I'm not sure that he has the better part of this one. Of course, 50% means it could go either way, and I don't know what the other half of that bet would be. 50% probability on another major boom, and then you have anything in between is also possible. My reaction to forecasting the market is to say, just stay clear of people who are asking you to put money on it.
So, one of the great questions I had, Jamie.
Please, short term. What?
One of the great questions I had, and I get it a lot, is that the Feds have increased money supply by 400% since 2008 with all the economic stimulus. And yet inflation only bounces around at about 1%. For those of you on Social Security, you know that for years you didn't get any cost of living adjustments. If money supply has increased 400%, why do we only see 1% inflation?
Well, the question is, why did we ever believe that the Fed controlled the inflation rate by pumping up or pulling back the money supply. This was a statistically based, theoretically based argument advanced by a group of Chicago economists in the 50s and 60s that took over the world in the 1980s, but it never had any actual substance to it. And from the middle 1980s onward, the inflation rate in the United States became substantially determined by what was going on in the whole world, not just what was happening in the U.S. So the collapse of the Soviet Union and the commodities slump did in inflation, and then later on the rise of China put a ceiling on the price of most of the consumer goods that Americans buy. And so the inflation, between those two things, the inflation rate has been pretty well constrained. There is no reason to believe that by giving banks free reserves or by buying up their government bonds and loading them up with cash that you're going to have any significant, any very large effect on economic activity. It's just not the way the system works. Banks don't need reserves in order to lend. They don't lend their reserves. Right. When they lend when they have customers that they want, that they consider to be creditworthy, and they don't need reserves for that. Banks are in the business of creating deposits by making loans. So the whole idea that this was some kind of bottled up inflation was a complete misunderstanding of the fundamental processes of banking from the very beginning.
We mentioned the stock market, and as our listeners know, the vast majority of stocks are owned by the power elites in this country. I forget what the percentage is, something like 85% of the individual stock portfolios out there are owned by the upper 10% or something like this. You have written very compellingly about what you call the predatory class here in America, that modern America has fallen prey to a wealthy, government-controlling predatory class. And I'm going to quote something that you wrote, and it's absolutely shocking. Quote, "Today, the signature of modern American capitalism is neither but a benign competition nor class struggle, nor an inclusive middle-class utopia. Instead, predation has become the dominant feature, a system where the rich have come to feast on the decaying systems built for the middle class. The predatory class is not the whole of the wealthy. It may be opposed by some of similar wealth, but very few. It is the defining feature, the leading force, this predatory class, and its agents are in full control under the government in which we live." Jamie, that's shocking. Please explain.
Well, to put that in context, this was, I believe you're quoting from a book that I published in 2008. It was called The Predator State. And what I was trying to get at fundamentally here was, I'm not trying to make a blanket condemnation of the ethics or morals of an entire group of people, but to get at a particular crucial piece of what I consider to be the political economy of the country, which is that organized political forces were preying on the social systems that had been created in the 20th century to stabilize the middle class. So you're looking at the effort back then, and it still crops up from time to time, to privatize Social Security, basically to turn it over, or large parts of it over to fund managers and private insurance companies, life insurance companies, or the constant struggle over a healthcare system, which is always has to bend to the existence of private health insurers whose really only reason for existence is to sort out the healthy from the sick and to refuse to insure the sick so that the healthy can have lower premiums. Or the way in which the drug benefit in Medicare was designed to make it relatively easy for the large pharmaceutical companies to continue to earn exorbitant profits on that system. So that's what I meant that's what I was getting at by pointing to predatory activity. Oh, and the at that time, and of course at any moment it could break out again, the most dominant feature of economic activity was the creation of fraudulent mortgages, which were then packaged into securities and sold to gullible investors all around the world. That's what brought down the system in 2007, 2008. So anybody who has lived through that period in California knows what happened afterwards is that the people who that people's home values collapsed, and that many hundreds of thousands were actually foreclosed and forced out of their homes as a result of this abuse of the system by predatory loan makers. So that, I think, was indeed, in many respects, the salient feature of American of the let's say the American politics of the economy, both then, and I don't think it's stopped. And certainly, for example, in the Obama administration, the failure to protect homeowners from fraudulent foreclosures was another aspect of the same thing.
Right. We're seeing a comeback in securitized assets, as if 2008 had never happened. Do you want to comment on that?
Well, we shall see what we shall see when if this causes another massive collapse in confidence in the system. I don't know whether it will or it won't, but it really depends on what is in the assets and whether we get to a point where large numbers of them start to default.
I'm going to ask one final question here before I turn the microphone over to Mary. She's done a great job in preparing an outline for our show with our assistant producer, Elliot Hershkowitz-Hale. And my question is this. We've had Bob Gates on the show. We've had Leon Panetta on the show. And they both confirm something we've known for a long time, that the United States has been in a war economy ever since World War II. That as Bob Gates said, war is a business and business is good. I can't believe he said that on the air and on the record, but he did. And it was echoed by Leon Panetta. War is and the defense economy, defense industry is the engine, it would seem, of our economy. Now we're picking a fight in Syria. Who is the true aggressor in Syria? We may be picking a fight with North Korea. Do you want to comment on their perception that we've been in a war-based economy ever since World War II, and that, quote-unquote, war is a business and business is good?
Well, let's separate out the elements of that. One of them has been the development and maintenance of a strategic arsenal, which, whatever its justification, was always, from a very early stage, vastly in excess of any reasonable number for the deterrence of an attack on the American mainland. And was, as Dan Ellsberg has laid out in his remarkable new book, Doomsday, an instrument of foreign policy, and one which poses the danger of the extension of life on the planet if it should ever actually end up being used. So there's that, and that is certainly, there's an entire industry behind the building and maintenance of that arsenal, and that's something which is an important issue to take up right now, because the White House and the Congress are pressing for the so-called modernization of that arsenal, and for certain kinds of new weapons which would lower the threshold at which nuclear weapons are used. And that is, again, I think it's a very frightening prospect, and one which bears a threat not only for us and not only for any potential adversary, but for all life on the planet, because the phenomenon of nuclear winter is a real thing, and it would lead to essentially starvation, crop failures and starvation for everybody. Now that is, I think, one set of issues. Second set of issues has to deal with the conventional forces of the United States. And there the picture is a little bit different. Actually, since World War II, and certainly since Korea and Vietnam, we haven't had the kind of large-scale mobilization or use of ground forces that we had in those wars. Peak force in Vietnam was 500,000. Peak force in Iraq was probably not a third of that, if my memory serves. Now, that's one point, and the second point to make about it is that we've learned in Iraq and Afghanistan, as we should have learned in Vietnam, learned for a while and then forgot, that however great the power of these forces, their usefulness as tools of foreign policy, tools of an international policy, is very limited. And nobody is more aware of that than the military officers who have to lead those forces, because they, I'm sure, have some. In fact, I know from my experience with them that they have a reasonable skepticism about being thrown into environments where one cannot prevail in the long run. And you cannot prevail in the long run in an urban environment where the advantage is entirely with a resisting population, and it's very hard to prevail other than just to maintain the status quo in a large mountainous country like Afghanistan, where again you have no direct allegiance from the larger population, and lots of other players who were there to cause trouble. So we have a situation in which we are once again learning the painful lesson that the military is the most valuable military is one that you don't have to use at all, one that simply keeps your adversaries aloof. But once you get into the position that you throw them in to a war that you didn't have to fight, which was the case in Iraq, the fact that they cannot do what what civilians would like them to do, and it's not their fault, but it's not possible, becomes entirely clear.
And do you agree with the premise that the modernization of our nuclear forces includes the scope of miniaturization of nukes, from the big strategic weapons that could take out whole cities to the tactical nukes that would, merely, quote unquote, merely take out, say an enemy force on a battlefield? The detonation could be dialed down. What are the prospects for modernization, miniaturization, and the shift towards tactical nuclear weapons?
I guess I'm not entirely sure what the modernization, so-called, is going to lead to in that respect. But let me just be clear. Miniaturization is a process which enables one to deliver a physically smaller but still very big warhead capable of destroying, let's say Hiroshima or Nagasaki many, many times over, because we're talking about hydrogen bombs. These are very, very big and powerful weapons. Even if you can put 10 of them in the cone of a missile, which has been the case for quite a long time. Tactical weapons would, I think, presumably mean going back to weapons that we had on the battlefield in the 1950s, and I don't know how long after that, and that we still have, I believe, in cruise missiles, which are relatively low-yield atomic weapons. They don't have the thermonuclear component, so far as I'm aware. And those, that is a very, let's say, a very problematic business because it lowers the threshold at which the first use could occur. In the early 1960s, just to give you an example, someone I got to know quite well late in life, Walt Rostow, who became the National Security Advisor under President Johnson, was out in West Germany checking out what was the case in the airfields, and he discovered that were German fighter bombers with American nuclear weapons, atomic bombs, sitting in runways 10 minutes drive from the border. And this was clearly a situation where even at the slightest incursion, they would be put into the air, and the command and control consisted, he told me, an American officer with a pistol who was not available when he went out to check. So it was a situation where it was absolutely urgent as a matter of sensible strategy to pull these things back from the border. That kind of danger is one that is entirely to be avoided, absolutely to be avoided under all circumstances, it seems to me.
Yeah. Jamie, one of the real reasons I love and respect your work is you work very closely. In fact, you're the chairman of Economists for Peace and Security, formerly known as Economists Against the Arms Race, and later Economists Allied for Arms Reduction. You also joined the 2008 project known as Soldiers for Peace, a documentary for global peace and against all wars, which has won numerous awards at film festivals. Do you want to talk about what your role is in the peace movement and what what impact, if any, economists can have on peace and security?
Okay, well, first of all, Economists for Peace and Security is an organization that was founded in the late 1980s. I became chair of the board in 1996, and I served for 20 years. I've since stepped down, and the new chair is a very good economist, Stephanie Kelton. The role of that organization has been to provide a forum for discussion of the economic aspects of important security questions, and also not just military security, but the organization has also played a role in providing a forum for discussion of economic issues that have similar repercussions. The Great Crisis in 2008 being the prime example, and it's a useful function. I wouldn't exaggerate its role in the larger world, but the fact is that there have always been a certain number of people who are trained as professional economists who have concerned themselves with the questions of strategic policy, with questions of defense procurement, with questions of conflict reduction. This has been going back to the post-war period. Economists played a substantial and quite constructive role in trying to defuse some of the most dangerous aspects of the nuclear threat, and they played at least they are available to play a role in analyzing the effects of defense spending on the economy, the diversion of resources from civilian, scientific, and engineering activities into purely military activities, a whole range of questions of that kind. There is no established forum inside the mainstream economic organizations, the major economic organizations for this, and so it was necessary to have a separate organization, a affiliated organization that focused on it. It was set up by a number of very prominent people, Nobel Prize-winning economists like Kenneth Arrow, just recently deceased, Lawrence Klein, James Tobin, my father, Vasily Leontiev, people of real eminence of that earlier generation, and I've been helping to carry forward that work. That's been the major thrust and focus of that organization. As I say, I think it's useful. I think that it has provided a voice that would otherwise not be there, and it cautions about, for example, the futility and waste associated with launching the war in Iraq. Assessments of the long-term cost of that war, careful totting up of how much it costs to care for the veterans who are injured in that conflict, as well as the costs of the equipment and the other costs associated with deploying the forces. So it's been actually very useful, and it's one which has brought together, to say, people who are security professionals, people who are peace activists, in a place where they have a lot of constructive things to say to each other.
And before I turn over the mic here to Mayor, who's been waiting very patiently. Thanks, Mayor. I want to ask you, what are the estimates for some of those wars' costs? What is the never-ending war on terrorism costing us? What is the war in Iraq costing us? What is the war in Afghanistan costing us? Down at the VA, I've heard estimates that just the rehab for GIs and Marines coming back with brain trauma, caring for them will top out at hundreds of billions of dollars just for brain trauma. This is enormous cost. What are your estimates of some of the costs of this insane war against terror?
This was work that was carried out over a number of years by two economists closely associated with EPS. One of them was Linda Bilmes at Harvard University, and the other one was Joe Stiglitz at Columbia, a very well-known senior figure in the profession. And they produced monographs, books on the subject. A ballpark figure that from some years ago was on the order of $3 trillion. It might be higher than that now. But yes, a very significant part of the the costs of a conflict like this is the fact that you have a very costly medical conditions that our veterans come back with, and that have to be treated over very long periods of time. These are very young people, and in many cases they are going to have needs that have to be met over decades. So adding those costs up really brings home to you the fact that this is not just once and done. Even if it's a relatively short period of active conflict, you've got physical traumas, you've got psychological traumas, you've got all kinds of issues that will continue to be require attention and for a very, very long time.
Thank you, Jamie. If you've just joined us, this is Heroes and Patriots. It's 26 minutes past the hour. I'm Mary Massey, and John Goodiron and I are speaking with James K. Galbraith. Mr. Galbraith holds the Lloyd M. Benson Jr. Chair of Government Business Relations at the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs, the University of Texas at Austin. You've already mentioned the fraudulent mortgages that contributed to the 2008 market collapse and economic collapse. Recently, we've seen the stock market drop considerably. Are we in a correction, do you feel, or is something else perhaps going on?
Well, this is a word that is used to describe a particular movement of the price, and if it drops 10% from a peak, they say, "Oh, that's a correction." So that's the term, and I think it hit that target on I think it was on Friday of last week. Mm-hmm. It's not a meaningful phrase. I mean, is 9% materially different from 11%? Well, no, it's not a qualitative distinction. What is going on here is clearly from the moment that the president took credit for the stock market at the State of the Union, it hit a peak, and I would surmise that the main reason why it hit that peak was a recognition that the Federal Reserve is on a path of rising interest rates that is going to continue. It's not going to be interrupted by, let's say, it might have been interrupted by a weak growth report or something of that nature. It didn't happen, and so it's likely that the Fed will continue to raise the short-term interest rate, and this is in a world where the long-term interest rates are still very low. So the gap between the two is very low, and people are moving money into cash, and that's a reaction that you see every time that the Fed raises rates in an environment like this. And that's going to destabilize asset markets, and not just in the United States, but all around the world.
Could you speak to Janet Yellen's legacy and her reasoning behind and stance behind the inflation rates? Could you just briefly speak about that as she winds down her tenure?
Yeah, well, I think that I have a lot of admiration for Janet Yellen, who has been one of the most forthright public servants that I think any of us have ever had the privilege of knowing, in the sense that she always proceeded by explaining her reasoning in a very clear and methodical way. But I think this has become, to some degree, a bit of a problem for the Federal Reserve, because when we know exactly what it's going to do, it becomes very difficult for the institution to change course. It's surrounded by people who are interpreting every single change of a comma or a semicolon in a public statement as having some Talmudic significance, and that is puts them in a bit of a box. And in the case of Janet Yellen, the box was that they had been for a very long time operating with a zero short-term interest rate. The long-term interest rates come down, and then that makes it much harder to get out of the short-term rate, while they were themselves saying that they would like to get back to a world where the short-term rate was maybe 3% or something of that nature, so that they would then have some flexibility to lower it again. But they can't get from where they are to the target that they quite artificially set for themselves, without destabilizing the capital markets, without causing people to move money out of yielding assets and into cash, for fear that everybody else is going to do the same and that the prices will fall. And so you see these very sharp movements in the prices that are a result of that anticipation. And that I don't see a way around that other than to basically say, well, we're not actually going to return to what we previously thought was a normal level of short-term interest rates. Not going to happen.
Very good. Could you speak a little bit about how do you expect Jerome Powell to react towards Chinese supremacy and potential likelihood?
Oh, I wouldn't exaggerate the importance of any chairman of the Federal Reserve in the rise of a country like China in the World Economic League tables. He doesn't have a role particularly in that. Where the Fed does have a role and where it will be reactive is to changes in the valuation of the dollar. And one of the reasons why I think the Fed locked itself into the course of rising interest rates over the past year was that it observed that the dollar had peaked and was falling. It's fallen substantially since the early part of 2017. And so the Fed is always going to be, I think, wary of the possibility of a speculative movement getting going in which people are selling dollars because they fear it's going to fall further. And they don't want that to happen, so they lean against it, and I think that's what's happening now. And then, of course, you get the reaction I just described as people move into cash.
Right, right. So could we talk about the recent tax reform bill as it relates to
reform is not the right word.
Sorry?
Reform is not the word I would use. Reform is a word that's intended to convey that good things happened.
So, well, yeah. So
let's call it the new tax law.
Okay, let's call it the new tax law.
The gift to the Republican donor base.
Yeah, could you speak about what it does for the middle class and what it does specifically for the wealthy class, and then the lower class? Let's go on the record with this.
Well, just as a broad matter, the tax bill was intended mainly to accomplish two things. One was to give corporations a bigger cash flow by cutting the rates on corporate profits tax. And the second was to give a disproportionately large personal income tax cut to the very wealthy. Now, to make the numbers come out, a number of other things were done, and those things were targeted pretty sharply on let's say, the home-owning, state and local income tax-paying middle classes of the higher income, higher property valued states, like, for example, California, just to take one randomly chosen example, but also New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, Massachusetts, places which have an interesting propensity to vote for someone other than the Republican nominee for president. And the effect of that is going to be to squeeze those households to a certain degree, and it's going to put pressure on local governments, state governments, to reduce their tax to change their tax systems to reduce their provision of goods and services, and particularly schooling and other things that are based upon the property tax, or infrastructure that's based upon the income tax, and so forth. So we're going to see a tax bill that was designed with a certain amount of, let's say, malice of forethought to really do some damage to what we call the blue states. And that is, I'm sure, going to play out over some time. With respect to lower income households, the effects are, I think, substantially smaller. There's an elimination of the exemptions, increase in the standard deduction. That's going to affect households depending upon a lot of different things. It will give a modest benefit to a fair number of them in the short run, but then that I believe goes away expires after a certain period of time, while the major tax benefits to business are permanent.
Right, right. Just as an aside, how is the idea of folks working part-time for Medicaid benefits play into this? Do you see that as a good thing, a healthy thing for the economy? Is it fair? What's your opinion on that?
Well, Medicaid is a program that provides medical services to people who are relatively low income,
right,
meet an assets test. And to say that they should be working, a great many people in that position are not in the workforce.
Right.
And so this is I think it's a peculiarly the word I would use comes to mind is a kind of a vicious way to make a political point. I have no idea how they apply to people who are in nursing homes, a great many of whom are paid for by Medicaid. Are they supposed to show up to work? That would certainly place an interesting challenge for the employment offices, right. Not to mention the effect on the people involved. So I'd have to look at what I know. This is something that's happening in Mr. McConnell's home state of Kentucky, and I haven't had time to figure out exactly what they're doing, other than to recognize that this is it's a really out there in terms of an attack on people who are specifically quite poor, and in addition to that, have a tendency to get sick. A decent, civilized society provides health care to people who need it, period.
Well, I think I've read that there are 9 states that are considering this shift, and I was just curious to know what your input was or your thoughts on it. Earlier in the program, we mentioned 2 books, Inequality, What Everyone Needs to Know. I think it was released in 2016, and Welcome to the Poison Chalice, also released in 2016. Could you talk about what the second book is about, Welcome to the Poison Chalice? I'm curious.
Yeah, the subtitle of that book is The Destruction of Greece and the Future of Europe.
Oh, okay.
And it describes, it's actually a running account of my experience acting as a friend and an informal counselor to the finance minister of Greece, Yanis Varoufakis, in the 5 months of his ministry in early February to early July of 2015. And I was acting as kind of a back office staff and liaison in certain respects to the press and to some friends in the American government and elsewhere to try and help the Greek government in its negotiating position within Europe to get a more rational deal. Mm-hmm. Needless to say, we did not succeed, and what has happened since then is that Greece has been in a continuing noose of unforgiving austerity, which has had the effect of greatly really, it's a bit like an economic policy run by a collection agency. That businesses are being foreclosed, homes are being foreclosed, public assets are being sold off, and the Greeks are really have been put through a terrible ringer, which has demoralized the entire country and also undermined its political. The notion that it is a self-governing democracy is one which is now essentially, effectively no longer the case.
Wow. If you've just joined us, it's about 20 minutes before the hour, and this is Heroes and Patriots. I'm Mary Massey, along with John Goodiron. We are speaking for James K. Galbraith this hour. He is the Lloyd M. Benson Jr. Chair of Government Business Relations at the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs, the University of Texas at Austin. You have a website, I believe, that I would like to call attention to for our listeners to look at some of the great work and efforts that you have been involved with over many decades. Could you tell our listeners where they could find information about you and some of the activities that are underway involved in your programs?
Sure. Well, the website that we maintain, it's a very old-fashioned and let's say simple website. It's called the University of Texas Inequality Project, and it can be found by Googling that phrase. I think would be the easiest way.
Could you say that again? I'm looking
University of Texas Inequality Project, and it is. We just use it as a way of making a public record of the work that we've been doing over the years. The basic task that work addressed was that we felt, and it was clear, that economists who wanted to analyze what was happening to the problem of inequality around the world didn't have enough information to go on. And the historical record was just very sporadic, it was inconsistent, and it could not be repaired by the same techniques that had been used to collect it in the first place, because you can't go back and go out on a survey and ask people what their incomes were 5 or 15 years ago. So we went into various archives, published records, and came up with data sets that were administrative, that were consistent over time, and used them as the raw material for making calculations in a very simple way. And then my students have worked out various ways to present this material with charts and maps, and the data sets themselves, so that the research community, anybody else who wants to have a look at it, can go there and take a look, read the working papers, download the data sets, and use that in any other things that they may want to apply it to. And it's been increasingly used as a resource by other economists who are working on these questions. And I think we've been able to demonstrate that for the purposes of comparative work, comparing countries, comparing regions, comparing across time, that this data set is really quite good, and it enables you to see what's going on in the world in respect to inequality much more clearly than a lot of the others. There's more signal, less noise, which means that you can pick out global trends. And that gets to a very basic point for an economist, which is, what is driving this? Is there something we can say that is a kind of unified phenomenon behind movements of inequality? And the answer to that is apparently yes. And not surprisingly, it has to do with the role of global finance. It has to do with interest rates, with debt crises, with the relationship between creditors and debtors. And when the world went into major financial crises beginning in 1980 and up to 2000, inequality went up in lots of different places sequentially, but basically around the world for 2 decades. That's the great phenomenon that really lies behind this data, and the thing that we were able to point out, which really wasn't, it's sort of clear. Many people know this intuitively, but it wasn't obvious in the numbers until we constructed our data sets and showed it.
Jamie, we have a listener, a great friend of the show, who's with the Rockefeller Foundation, the Guggenheim Foundation, and she's asked you to talk about the Inequality Project and what its impact is on studying the political divide in our country.
Well, it's very interesting. We did do some work on inequality inside American states, and there was a technical question there, because up until 2000, there wasn't annual data on all of the states. Basically, the annual surveys had samples were too small to get reliable estimates for the very many small states that we have. So we went to another data set and calculated what the numbers were, and got an annual series going back to 1969. And that enables us to ask, well, do changes in inequality year over year or over a period of time have an effect on the way our politics turns out? And one of my students, a very talented young woman named Jae-hee Choi, did a calculation for the states from 1990 to 2014. And then we compared that result, how much inequality had increased in all of the 50 states in the District of Columbia, with the 2016 election result. And the results are very striking because it turns out that the 14 states with the biggest increase in inequality, all 14 states in that position, all voted for one candidate. And the states with the biggest increases in inequality, all without exception, voted for Hillary Clinton. And the states with the smallest increases in inequality, with a few exceptions, mostly voted for Donald Trump. So what's going on? I think it illustrates something that is an important aspect of American politics, which is that the Democratic Party is a party of both ends of the income distribution. It's the party of wealthy professionals in coastal cities, so let's say San Francisco or Los Angeles or Seattle or New York City or Boston or Philadelphia, you name it, or Chicago for that matter, and it's the party also of the minority communities and immigrant communities, which tend to be low income. And so when those two add up to a plurality in a state, that's a Democratic state. Whereas the Republican Party tends to draw on the rural areas, on the suburbs, largely substantially white and without not the wealthiest of the economic sectors. And so the Republican Party tends to draw on the middle of the distribution. And it's an odd thing in the sense that while Democrats are associated with policies that reduce inequality, the effect of those policies is to strengthen Republicans. Republicans are associated with policies that increase inequality, and it may be that we'll discover that the effect of that is to strengthen the Democrats. We'll find out whether that pattern continues to hold, but it has been one which has been emerging over three or four electoral cycles, and is now just very, very strong. And it clearly shows in Trump's election, because the states that he carried, that he took back from the Democrats, notably Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, are states where the rise in inequality has been not so great. And some states where the rise in inequality is accelerating, Texas being an interesting example, but also all across the South, Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, are states which are moving slowly and from a low base, but moving toward the Democrats. So we may be seeing in this data a way of tracking an ongoing realignment of American politics. It's been a generation or more that the South has shifted from the Democrats to the Republicans, but it may be as the immigrant communities grow here and as the cities become more liberal, more professional, more like cities in the rest of the country, that the Democrats will have another turn in the South.
I've had a listener to send me a link to a different website that you appear on. It may be old, but it's ineteconomics.org. Is that
INET, yes, and Institute for New Economic Thinking, yes.
Tell us about that, because this has some wonderful information that you are involved in as an expert. Could you talk about that briefly?
Well, the Institute for New Economic Thinking has been something that was been around now for a decade or a couple of decades, I guess, and it is a New York-based institute which provides research funding to a pretty wide spectrum of people. I'm a very modest beneficiary of their support. They've given some support to the Inequality Project, and that so I also contribute occasional commentary, occasional papers which they distribute. I'd say that's basically what there is to know about it.
Okay, I was just interested in the partnerships that are listed at Cambridge, INET Institute, and Fung Global Institute. Those all look like...
Yeah, they support a wide range of activity, and they host and organize conferences on a fairly regular basis. It's a fairly big operation these days.
So here we are in 2018. If you had your crystal ball or would like to make a projection on the next 10 years of economic recovery, growth, etc., what could you offer our listeners on that point?
Well, there's a comment which is often attributed to my father, but was actually uttered by a member of the Council of Economic Advisors under Richard Nixon named Ezra Solomon, that the purpose of economic forecasting is to make astrology look respectable. So I'm going to abide by that wisdom and say the notion that economists have crystal balls is not one that does credit to the profession at all. what I wish would happen, leaving aside the economy, is I wish the discipline of economics would wake up to the realities of the world that we're in. For most academic economics departments are kind of sealed off from the real world and live in a kind of 18th century environment of general equilibrium thinking. And it's clear that we're not there, that we are living in a world which is radically uncertain and unstable, and where basic questions, not only about the position of the United States in that world, are unclear at this point, but also about the ability of the economic system to be compatible with the survival and sustainability of the planet. And economics, I think, has done very little, not nearly enough, to contribute to a serious discussion of those questions. I'm not sure it's constitutionally capable of adjusting. So there's a real need for universities to foster new disciplines that are addressing these important questions and addressing them in a serious way. And that would be my hope. It's certainly not a forecast. On a matter like that, one cannot be optimistic.
Right. You and your father have both been critical of folks in your profession. Is that the main criticism, if you will, that you both share?
Oh, I would say it's relatively minor in the scheme of things. Because the economics profession is a relatively minor entity. Much more important is the question of whether a society has the capacity to address its problems in a coherent and effective way. This is a problem that my father described as a problem of social balance, the problem of private affluence and public squalor. For us, it's that problem continues, but on top of it is the problem of sustainability, the problem of making a transformation to an ethically and acceptable future, and one that provides an actual livable future for generations down the road. This is something which requires us to really turn our attention to it seriously, and it may require economists just to relinquish the stage, because I say if the profession cannot usefully contribute to that, you need to find other professions that can.
Jamie, I recently attended Cowan Associates, the partnership meeting for Cowan Associates. You probably know them. They advise about $2.5 trillion of public pension assets. They're kind of the class of the field, Cowan Associates. And they have something called Cowan College every year. And their keynote speaker this year was one of the most powerful and most admired women in the world, the editor of The Economist, Zany Milton Beddoes. And a good part of her remarks were about China, how things will play out, the supremacy of the United States, and certainly the supremacy of the dollar as the world's reserve currency is falling, that China may emerge as the only true superpower in the world at the expense of the EU and the United States. I'm thinking that may not be a bad thing, that we assume that China will rule the world like the United States once did, with the authoritarian grip. But will Chinese supremacy going forward be something that maybe will not be too scary? What do you think?
Well, first of all, I question the premise that there would be something that could be described as Chinese supremacy. China is a very big country, arguably the largest in the world, and it's now increasingly a developed country. But I know a good deal about China. I advised the Chinese government through the United Nations in the 1990s on macroeconomic reform, and this at a crucial period. The Chinese government is always first and foremost concerned about the stability and sustainability of Chinese society. And this problem is one that is never solved in China. It has always got new manifestations. So it always requires their very intense attention. Most recently, the issues being in the environmental question on one side, which has become with the success of industrialization, really intolerable. And the question of corruption, which likewise with the concentration of income and wealth also became substantially intolerable. So dealing with those questions, we've got high priorities. The notion that China is viewing the world the way Britain did in the 19th century, the way the United States did in the 20th century, is, I think, a great misconception. China is, of course, concerned about securing its resource supply and about extending its engineering capacity to its neighbors in Central Asia and so forth. This is the One Belt, One Road initiative. But this is not the notion that it has some grand design to become the stabilizing superpower. I think is it would defy common sense for Chinese officials to think of themselves in those terms. I think they realize that is not going to happen, and that it doesn't need to happen.
Just moving along quickly, and again, we're starting to get a lot of questions in from listeners, and one has to do with Trump. So we know that Trump just passed a stimulus plan that included the huge tax reform package, if you want to call it tax reform, which is going to cost trillions going forward. If economic growth were to slow down, do you think Trump is likely to pass another stimulus package?
Well, it's again a forecasting question, and the fact is, what happened last week was already a substantial surprise. That the Democratic leadership in the Senate managed to get a very large part of its so-called Better Deal program from a few months ago pushed into a law, which is now an agreement, and we're taking stock of the fact that this means a very substantial change and a more expansionary fiscal policy than was in the cards just a few weeks ago. So I think it's what it tells you is that this administration has no fixed principles, which means it could be a good thing, could be a bad thing, but it would be. It's harder to predict what an administration without fixed principles will do than it is to predict what an administration that has fixed principles will do.
Right. Well, we are just about out of time. I would like to have you give our listeners again a way of looking at your achievements and your activities on the website again, and maybe how people can contact you.
Well, I'm easily reached, but the main thing to look at is at the website of the University of Texas Inequality Project, which is an informal research group that's basically myself and cohorts of graduate students over the years. Mm-hmm. I think we've done reasonably good work, and there's interesting stuff on that website for people who want an idea of what my research agenda has been. For other things, I highly recommend that people look at the website of Economists for Peace and Security, EPSUSA.org. And for those who really want to make a contribution here in the literal sense, EPS is a nonprofit organization which is, I think, well worthy of support. It's something which is carries out a small but very important function in trying to contribute to a climate of common sense and, let's say, non-belligerence in the world, and a world which is increasingly, where belligerence is increasingly dangerous. That's an important role.
Thank you so much for being our guest today, Jamie K. Galbraith.
Yeah, JB, thanks a lot. You're the best.
Yeah, thank you. I enjoyed it. Nice to talk to you both.
All right. Well, bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.
So we have been speaking with Jamie K. Galbraith. He is the chairman of Economists for Peace and Security, formerly known as Economists Against the Arms Race, and later Economists Allied for Arms Reduction. Currently, he holds the Lloyd M. Benston Jr. Chair of Government Business Relations at the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs, the University of Texas at Austin. He has new books that we've talked about. He had a recent book, Inequality and Instability, which was published back in March of 2012. And then another interesting book that we did not really address is The End of Normal from Free Press, 2014. We are about out of time. I would like to thank again Elliot Hershkovitz-Hale, who is our associate producer, tech support from Govinda Dalton and Joel Thompson, and our underwriters, if I might, Dr. Richard Phillips of Ukiah Dental Center, Dunlap Roofing with offices in Ukiah, Fort Bragg, and Willits, Fry Vineyards and Winery located in Redwood Valley, and of course Ore Hot Springs Retreat and Spa located between Ukiah and Mendocino. And we also thank our supporters for contributing to KMEC Radio. This is KMEC Radio, KMEC LP 105.1 FM Ukiah, Mendocino Environmental Center, streaming on the web at kmecradio.org.